Hello, this is Mr. Buffington, and we are adding and subtracting integers. We're going to add integers, subtract integers, and do quite a bit of practice today. Let's get into it. Adding integers. Integers basically are positive and negative numbers. I'll give you some examples of integers here, just so that you can see some and what they look like. Basically includes positive and negative numbers, and that's what we're going to be adding and subtracting today. So our first example is 8 plus negative 3. I have a number line here along the bottom just to show some positive and negative numbers. Notice 0 sits right here in the middle. Positive numbers move to the right. Negative numbers starting at 0 move to the left. So if I were to add 8 plus negative 3, I would start out by going to 8. 8 is a positive number, so again I'm moving to the right. Negative 3. Haha! Changed it. Negative 3. There we go. So negative 3 would bring us back to being 5. So you'll see that that's how we add integers. When you're adding a positive and a negative, the negative kind of undoes the positive or goes in the opposite direction. Let me show you another example here real quick. Negative 3 plus 8. This is what that would look like. I would start at 0 and go negative 3. Then I would add 8, and I would also end up at 5. Notice we ended up at the same place whether we added 8 plus negative 3 or negative 3 plus 8. All right, now let's switch things up a bit and make the 8 negative and see what that does. So I have 3 plus negative 8. I would start out by going positive 3, and then I would go negative 8, bringing me to negative 5. So those are 3 examples of adding integers that I wanted to show you visually on the number line. Now let's look at those 3 examples and see what we can learn from them. And we will come to basically learn the rules for adding integers out of those 3 examples. First off, the order of the numbers does not matter when you're adding. See that? 8 plus negative 3, negative 3 plus positive 8. The order does not matter, and that is absolutely true. It does not determine whether it's positive or negative based on the order that it's in. Number 3, the final result, positive or negative, is based on the larger number, ignoring the signs. So, if you look at this one, the larger number is positive, 8, and so your final answer is positive, 5. In this one, the larger number, again ignoring the signs, I know negative 8 is smaller than positive 3, but 8 is bigger than 3, so if you ignore the signs, 8 is larger than 3, therefore the final answer will have the sign of the larger number ignoring the signs. In other words, there's more negatives than there are positives, is another way of looking at that. Another way to say it is a larger absolute value, but I don't really want to get into absolute values too much. But if you understand what that means, then you'll also understand that. And of course, number 2, when the signs are different, we subtract the numbers. Did you see that with this one here? 8 minus 3 is 5. 8 minus 3 is 5. 8 minus 3 is 5. All of them are subtraction, really. So when the signs are different, we subtract. I have a colleague who says, when the signs are different, you find the difference. I really like that. So let's try adding a couple of them. This is our practice. Go ahead and pause the recording. Try to add 15 plus negative 3. Hopefully you're back now. This is what we would do. The signs are different, so we're going to subtract. 15 minus 3 is 12. Then we ask ourselves, is it going to be a positive 12 or a negative 12? Well, I have 15 positives and only 3 negatives, so that means I have more positives than negatives. In other words, my positive number is larger, so my final answer is going to be positive 12. Here's another one, negative 11 plus 6. The signs are different, so we find the difference. I'm subtracting. 11 minus 6 is equal to 5. Is my answer going to be positive or negative? Well, which number is bigger, 11 or 6? 11 is bigger. There are more negatives than positives, so my answer is going to be negative in the end. One note about something that's a little bit different than this, and that's when the signs are the same. Let's talk about that real quick because this one should be real fast. When the signs are the same, you end up like this. 8 plus 2 is equal to 10. All right, pretty straightforward. We've done that since the time we were little, when we were adding in, like, kindergarten, first grade, third grade, whatever. It's the same with negatives. -7 plus -2 will give us -9. When the signs are the same, you add the numbers and keep the signs. All right? So if the signs are the same, you add the numbers and you keep the sign. This is different than multiplying and dividing. With multiplying and dividing, you have all sorts of different rules. A negative and a negative give you a positive. But when you are adding, you keep the sign. If I have a -7 and I add -2 more, I get an even bigger negative number. So that's an important thing. It's very different with adding and subtracting. All right. So let's do some practice adding numbers that have the same sign. And by the sign, I mean either positive or negative sign. You can pause the recording and try these two out on your own. We're back. 14 plus 3 is 17. That one may have seemed pretty easy to you. It's a positive 17 because we've done that kind of adding for a very long time. Let's move over to this one. -4 plus -9. The signs are the same, so we add the numbers. 4 plus 9 is 13. Is it going to be a positive 13 or a negative 13? Well, we keep the sign, so it's going to be a -13. And that's it for adding. Adding with the same signs and adding with different signs. Now we're going to move into subtracting, and I'm going to try to show you this on the number line. It gets a little tricky at one point. But we have to just remember this. Subtracting is the same as adding a negative or adding the opposite. Okay? So just bear with me as we go through this. 7 minus 3. 7 minus 3 gives you 4. All right. 7 minus 3 is 4. That's pretty easy. It's the same as adding the opposite of 3. So instead of saying minus 3, we could say plus -3. Look at that. Adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting. Bingo! Isn't that fantastic? Now, that didn't make our lives any easier, so I don't recommend you do this, but I just wanted to illustrate it. All right, next one. Subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. What if I get -3 minus 1? What would that look like on my number line? I start at 0, I go -3, and then I go -1 more, and I get -4. Okay. That's the same as saying -3 plus -1. See, instead of subtracting 1, we are adding the opposite. Does that make your life a little easier? Because we just learned the rules for adding a negative plus a negative gives you an even bigger negative. For me, I like seeing it this way instead. I know there's added parentheses. I know it seems a little more complicated, but I like seeing it that way because it makes a little bit more sense to me. Some people prefer to think of it like this, -3 minus 1. Some people want to think of it as -3 plus -1. Both ways are correct. And that's the great thing about subtracting. Now let's go to this next example. And this one here is where subtracting becomes totally ridiculous, and that's when you're subtracting a negative. When I think about this, I think of a bad guy in town, and the bad guy leaves town, so you're minusing one negative person, and that gives the same as a positive, and that's really confusing too. Minus a negative is the same thing as a positive. Taking away a negative is a good thing, and that's why, like, on the number line, this looks really funky. But the way that I remember this is if I see that double negative, I immediately change it into a positive. Again, taking away a negative is a good thing. It's a positive thing. All right? Remember, you are adding the opposite, right? So instead of subtracting -2, I'm going to add the opposite of -2. I'm going to add +2. I don't know if seeing it on the number line is a bit helpful at all, but just looking at that makes my life a whole lot easier going from this subtraction question to this addition question. So let's, again, take a look at what we learned. Subtracting is confusing, and we hate it. 3, personally, I'd change the sign if I ever saw the negative. If I saw that double negative, I would change the sign. Most of the rest I would leave alone. This one I would change in some cases, but according to whatever you get comfortable with, you're going to learn to change the sign or not change the sign with practice. But definitely every time I see this double negative, I would absolutely change it into being a positive. And number 2, change the sign when it makes your life easier. Otherwise, just leave it as is. That's my rule with subtracting. I find it just simplifies my life. So let's go ahead and do some practice with subtracting. I want you to pause the recording trying to subtract that 20 minus 4. Hello, we're back. 20 minus 4 is 16. That one wasn't so bad. All right, let's move on to our next subtraction question. Negative 8 minus 7. Welcome back. I hope you paused it and actually did it. You didn't, did you? Pause that recording and go back. Okay. I had negative 8 and I subtracted 7. That means I have negative 15. All right. Now, if that was difficult to do, you could also change it into being negative 8 plus the opposite of 7, or plus negative 7. And then we do it like we did the addition questions. The signs are the same, so we add them up. 8 plus 7 is 15. Is it positive or negative? It's negative. So that was the rules for adding. If you switch the sign to addition, you have to also remember those rules for adding, which is why we did them first. Oh my goodness, negatives. This is one of those typical questions that you'll see on a test where it's like, why do you even do this to ourselves here? But with this type of question, every single time when I see that minus negative, I switch it to being a positive to try and make my life easier. Then I just go back to the rules of addition. If the signs are different, I find the difference. 11 minus 5 is 6. Is it going to be a positive 6 or a negative 6? Well, what do I have more of? I have 11 positives and I have 11 negatives and only 5 positives. There's more negatives. So my final answer will be negative 6. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of negatives there. All right, so let's review what happened. We did adding integers, subtracting integers, and we hate our practice questions. I hope that was helpful for you. Make sure to practice this. This is one of the most difficult things you will do with integers. So go back and practice that. Hope that was helpful. Have a great day.